On my 69th birthday, the silence was not a gift, it was an accusation. In a house like mine, a sprawling, custom-built estate nestled deep within the rolling, verdant hills of Connecticut, silence is usually considered an achievement. It is a testament to thick, reinforced walls, triple-insulated windows, and a life carefully curated to keep the chaotic noise of the outside world at bay. I had spent a lifetime paying for this quiet, but on this particular evening, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the crushing sound of absence. I sat in my distressed leather armchair, the one my late wife Eleanor always teased made me look too serious, like a judge presiding over an empty courtroom. I stared at the grandfather clock standing like a sentinel in the hallway. Its steady, rhythmic tick-tock was the only thing marking the passage of time. 68 years had come and gone, filled with noise, struggle, and eventual triumph. Now the 69th was slipping away, one agonizing second at a time, entirely unnoticed by the two people who mattered most in this world. My phone lay dark and dormant on the polished oak side table beside me. I had picked it up a dozen times in the last hour, my thumb hovering tremulously over the contacts list, only to set it down again with a sigh that rattled in my chest. They're busy, I told myself, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. Julian has that new development project he's always talking about. And Harper is probably frantically planning another one of her high society charity galas. It was an excuse, and a poor one at that. A son doesn't forget his father's birthday. Not unless he is taught to. Or perhaps, not unless he has been given so much that there is nothing left to be grateful for. The house was filled with the ghosts of a happier time. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Julian's childhood laughter echoing from the grand staircase, the sound bouncing off the chandelier. I could see Eleanor arranging fresh hydrangeas on the marble mantelpiece, her smile brightening the entire room more than the crystal fixtures ever could. After Eleanor was gone, taken from me far too soon, I had poured everything I had left, my grief, my energy, my resources, into our son. I saw it as my sacred duty, my final promise to her. I had provided. I had enabled. I had shielded him from every sharp edge of the world. I had given him a life completely free of the hardships I had faced, building my architectural hardware empire from a dusty, unventilated workshop into a national brand. I had given him everything, I realized with a slow, sinking feeling in my gut, except for a reason to respect the man who had provided. Finally, the physical ache of loneliness became too much to bear. I wasn't looking for a lavish gift or a surprise party. I didn't need a cake or balloons. I just wanted a connection, a simple acknowledgement that I still existed in their glossy, fast-paced world. With a sigh that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of the last decade, I picked up the phone. My fingers felt clumsy and old as I typed out the message. I read it over and over, deleting words, trying to make it sound casual, trying to scrub away the scent of desperation. In the end, I settled on something simple. Something a father says to his son. Just wanted to say, I love you both. Hope you're having a good week. I hit send before I could second-guess myself again. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. The message was out there. The digital silence was broken. Now, I just had to wait. I didn't have to wait long. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed on the table, the vibration sounding like a thunderclap in the quiet room. A surge of warmth and hope shot through me, thawing the coldness in my chest. He replied. He remembered. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe I was just an old man getting sentimental and overthinking everything. I smiled to myself, a foolish, hopeful smile, as I reached for the phone, my heart feeling lighter than it had all day. Then I read the message. The screen glowed in the dim amber light of the living room, illuminating two sentences that felt colder than the October air outside. We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all. I read the words once, then twice. I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush, as if I'd been punched squarely in the chest. It wasn't the hot, fiery anger or petulance of a young man having a bad day. It was a dismissal. It was a corporate, sterile, HR-approved termination of a relationship. It was an execution. My son had just fired his father. My mind went numb. I couldn't process the sheer cruelty of it. Space. For 20 years after his mother died, My life had revolved around giving him a foundation to build his own. But I had made a terrible mistake. I hadn't given him a foundation. I had given him a fully furnished penthouse, and he was now complaining about the landlord. As the initial shock began to subside, replaced by a dull, throbbing pain, my eyes focused on a small detail below the text bubble. A detail that took the cold cruelty of the message and dipped it in pure poison. It was a small, red heart icon. And next to it, the notification. Harper liked this message. That was the moment everything broke. The heartbreak I felt wasn't a loud, shattering sound like glass hitting pavement. It was a quiet, deep fracture, the kind that splinters a solid foundation until the whole structure is compromised. Harper. His wife. The woman whose lavish wedding at the plaza I had paid for without blinking an eye. The woman who drove a Range Rover I had bought her as a welcome to the family birthday present. Her liking that message wasn't just agreement, it was applause. It was a digital high five for her husband's cruelty toward me. In that moment, I saw their partnership with blinding clarity. They weren't just a couple, they were a team, united in their entitlement, bonded by their shared disdain for the source of their comfort. The memories, the ones I had pushed aside for years to keep the peace, came flooding back. They weren't individual, isolated events anymore. They were connected, dots forming a perfect, ugly picture. The $500,000 down payment for their penthouse in Tribeca, an apartment they jokingly referred to as a starter home. The constant stream of credit card statements that arrived at my address, filled with charges from designer boutiques on Madison Avenue and five-star resorts in the Maldives, all quietly paid from my accounts. I remembered the phone call just 6 months ago. Julian's voice, breezy and casual, asking for $200,000 to fund Harper's latest business idea, an online gallery for emerging artists. He'd presented it not as a request, but as a notification of a withdrawal. When I had gently suggested he should perhaps use some of his own capital, he had laughed, a sound devoid of mirth. "Dad, this is my capital. It's the family money." I had let it go. I had transferred the money. I had always transferred the money. Because I loved my son, and because I was a fool who believed that one day he would wake up and understand, I was wrong. The text message on my phone was the irrefutable proof. To them, I wasn't a father. I wasn't even a person with feelings. I was a resource, a fund, an endless, faceless supply of money that was getting inconveniently sentimental in its old age. And now, the resource was being told to stop making contact. I stood up, my joints popping, and walked to the French windows, looking out at the manicured lawn stretching into the darkness. The garden Eleanor and I had planted together, the home I had built for my family. A profound coldness settled over me, extinguishing the last embers of my sadness. In its place was something new, something hard and clear and utterly calm. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. You cannot reason with entitlement. You cannot negotiate with disrespect. You can only cut off its supply. I walked back to the table and picked up my phone. My hands were perfectly steady now. I opened Julian's contact information. I scrolled down to the bottom and pressed the button that said, "Block this caller." A confirmation message popped up. I pressed block contact without a flicker of hesitation. Then I did the same for Harper. The digital silence was now complete, and it was on my terms. Then I made a second call. It rang twice before a familiar professional voice answered. "Richard Bennett." "Richard, it's Arthur," I said, my voice even and calm, surprising even myself. "Sorry to call so late." "Arthur." "No trouble at all. Everything all right." There was a note of genuine concern in his voice. Richard had been my lawyer and my friend for 30 years. He had drafted my will, set up my company, and, most importantly, he had set up the Vance Family Revocable Trust. "Everything is perfectly clear," I replied. "We need to meet. First thing tomorrow morning. It's time to make some significant adjustments to the trust." The drive to Richard Bennett's office the next morning felt different. I wasn't driving through the familiar winding roads of my town. I was moving through a new landscape, one defined by the cold clarity of my decision. The autumn leaves, which yesterday might have seemed beautiful and melancholic, now just looked like dead things waiting to be swept away. There was no sadness left in me. There was only a quiet, resolute purpose. Bennett and Associates occupied the top floor of a glass tower in Stamford that overlooked the Long Island Sound. It was a world of quiet power, smelling of expensive leather and old paper. a place where fortunes were protected and dynasties were managed through carefully worded documents. Richard was standing by his panoramic window when his assistant showed me in. He was a man tailored as sharply as his legal arguments, his silver hair perfectly in place, his suit a testament to understated wealth. He turned, and his eyes, which could dissect a contract with surgical precision, met mine. There was no pity in his gaze, only a deep, knowing understanding. He gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite his vast mahogany desk. "Arthur," he said, his voice calm. "Coffee." I shook my head and sat down. "Thank you, Richard. I just need to get this done." He nodded slowly, taking his seat. He folded his hands on the pristine desk, a single thick file placed squarely in the center between us. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer condolences. He simply waited. He was a good friend and an even better lawyer. He knew this wasn't a social call. I explained the events of the previous night, not with the trembling voice of a heartbroken father, but with the detached precision of a client reporting a breach of contract. I told him about my 69th birthday, the silence, the simple text I sent, and the 2-sentence reply I received. I even told him about Harper's digital seal of approval, the small heart that had felt like a stiletto blade. When I finished, the silence in the office returned, but this time it felt different. It was an assessing silence, a weighing of facts. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. "I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, Arthur," he said, his voice even. "Ever since Julian's 30th birthday party, the one you hosted at the yacht club. Do you remember what he said during his toast? He thanked you for providing the seed capital for his life, as if he were a startup and you were just an early-stage investor. I knew then that he didn't see you as a father anymore. He saw you as a bank. And Harper, she's not just a beneficiary of that bank. She's the chief financial officer." Hearing my own unspoken fears articulated so clearly by a rational man like Richard was a profound relief. It was a validation. It wasn't me being a bitter old man. This was a reality that had been visible to others for a long, long time. I had just been the last one to accept it. Richard slid the thick file across the desk. The gold lettering on the cover was stark. "The Vance Family Revocable Trust. Everything of significance is in here," he began, his tone shifting from that of a friend to that of legal counsel. "The deed to their penthouse is held by the trust. The lease agreements for their vehicles are in the trust's name. Their credit lines are guaranteed by the trust's assets. And of course, the $30,000 monthly allowance is a direct disbursement from the trust." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You see, Arthur, when we set this up after Eleanor passed, we did it to protect your assets and to make things simple for Julian when you were gone. It's a revocable trust. Think of it as a steel safe. You as the grantor filled the safe with your assets. You as the sole trustee hold the only key. You can open it whenever you want, take things out, put new things in, or change the instructions about who gets the contents. Right now, the instructions name Julian and Harper as the primary beneficiaries. But the power, the key, it has never left your hand. You have absolute unilateral control to change any and all provisions of this trust at any time for any reason." I looked at. For years, I had seen that trust as a lifeline for my son, a way to ensure his comfort and security. Now I saw it for what it truly was. A tool, a mechanism of control that I had forgotten I possessed. I had been funding an insurgency against my own dignity, with my own money. I met Richard's gaze. There was no doubt in my mind. "The path." "Let's start the process," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I want them removed completely. Terminate the lease on the penthouse. Cancel every credit line. Stop the monthly disbursements, effective immediately. Everything, Richard." I leaned forward slightly, placing my hand on the file. "We're turning off the supply." While I was in Richard's office setting the board for the endgame, the first pieces were already being knocked over miles away in Manhattan. The game had begun, and my son and his wife had no idea they were even playing. I can picture the scene perfectly, reconstruct it with agonizing detail, as if I were a fly on the wall. I can do this because it was a scene they had performed 100 times before. Only this time, the script had been changed without their knowledge. They were having lunch at Per Se, a temple of gastronomy where the price of a single meal could feed a family of 4 for a month. It was their natural habitat, a world of hushed tones, panoramic views of Central Park, and food that was arranged more than it was cooked. Harper was likely taking an artfully composed photo of her truffle-dusted risotto for her social media followers, carefully adjusting the lighting to make sure her diamond rings caught the glare. Julian would be swirling a $1,000 bottle of vintage Burgundy, pontificating to the patient sommelier about its subtle notes of oak and blackberry. They were performing the role of wealthy, influential people, a role they had mastered without ever having to read the source material of hard work or consequence. The meal concluded, as it always did, with laughter and the quiet, respectful placement of a leather-bound bill folder on their table. Julian would have picked it up with that casual air of ownership he had, a gesture he'd learned from watching me, but without understanding the weight behind it. He wouldn't even have looked at the four-figure total. Why would he? The money wasn't real to him. It was a concept, a river that flowed endlessly from a distant mountain he never had to climb. He would have handed the waiter his American Express black card, the one made of titanium, the one he arrogantly called his heavy metal, and leaned back, ready to discuss whether they should fly to Aspen or St. Bart's for the weekend. A few minutes would have passed, long enough for the conversation to resume, long enough for the performance to continue. Then the waiter would have returned to the table, but this time his expression would not be one of obsequious service. It would be a perfect, professional mask of apology. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Vance," he would have said, his voice low so as not to disturb the other diners, "but the card has been declined." Julian's first reaction would have been a short, incredulous laugh, a reflex. Declined. "That's impossible. Run it again. Your machine must be acting up." It was a statement of fact, not a request. In his world, that card did not decline. The universe did not operate that way. Harper would have looked annoyed, bothered by this small, vulgar tear in the fabric of their perfect afternoon. The waiter would have obliged, of course. He would have walked back to the terminal, swiped the heavy metal card again, and returned a minute later with the same result. "My apologies again, sir. It seems there is an issue with the card. Perhaps another form of payment." The annoyance on Julian's face would now be mixed with a flicker of genuine embarrassment. He was being challenged in his own arena. He would have pulled out a second card, a platinum visa, with the dismissive wave. "Here, this one has no limit." But it did have a limit, a new one, set to 0 by Richard Bennett's paralegals less than an hour ago. The waiter's third trip to the table would have been more somber. The professional smile was gone, replaced by a look of cautious concern. He knew, as all service staff in these places know, that the scent of money can turn to the stench of insolvency in seconds. Harper, sensing a real problem, would have stopped scrolling through her phone. "Julian, what is going on?" she'd hiss, her eyes darting around. She would then offer her own card, a sapphire reserve, with the look that dared the universe to decline it too. It was declined. The table, once a stage for their affluence, was now an island of quiet, escalating panic. The laughter was gone. Their voices were now urgent whispers. "What is happening?" Harper would demand, her voice rising in pitch. "Did you miss a payment?" "Of course I didn't miss a payment." Julian would snap back, his confidence completely shattered. "My father's office handles all of it. It's all automated through the trust." It's impossible. That word again. Impossible. The word of a man who had never faced a closed door. He'd pull out his phone, a desperate attempt to restore order to his crumbling reality. "I'm calling Dad. There's been some kind of massive screw-up at the bank." He would tap the screen, bringing my contact photo up. He would press the call button and raise the phone to his ear, expecting to hear the familiar ring, the sound of his safety net deploying. But there would be no ring, just the flat, immediate silence of a call that goes straight to voicemail. No rings, no connection. His brow would furrow in confusion. He would try again. Same result. The connection was instantly severed. A cold dread would begin to creep into his expression. This wasn't a technical error. This felt different. He'd switched to text messages, his thumbs flying across the screen. "Dad, what's going on with the cards?" "None of them are working. Call me." He would hit send, expecting the blue bubble to appear with the word "delivered" beneath it. Instead, a green bubble would pop up, indicating a standard SMS, and underneath it, a small, damning notification in red letters: "Message failed to send." He would stare at it, his mind refusing to connect the dots. Then he'd try again, and again, the red letters mocking him each time. And then the horrifying realization would dawn on him. This wasn't a network issue. This wasn't a banking error. This was a wall. A deliberate, impenetrable wall. He had been blocked. "He blocked me," he would whisper, his voice hollow with disbelief, realizing the silence he had requested was now being enforced upon him. "My own father blocked my number." Harper's face would have turned pale beneath her expensive makeup. The problem was no longer about paying for lunch. It was existential. Why would he do that? "What did you do?" she would ask, her voice sharp with accusation. "I didn't do anything," he'd insist, his mind racing, trying to find a reason, an explanation for why the world had suddenly turned upside down. We told him we needed some space." The absurdity of the situation would have hit them then. Stranded in one of the most expensive restaurants in New York, unable to pay. "How are we going to pay for this?" Harper would whisper, frantically looking around to see if anyone was watching their little drama unfold. "The mortgage payment is due on the 1st, Julian, and the lease on my Range Rover. What are we going to do?" A desperate hope would flicker in Julian's eyes. "The allowance," he'd say. "The $30,000. It was due yesterday. It has to be in the checking account. It's automatic." "Then check it," Harper would command. "Check it now." With trembling hands, Julian would have opened his banking app, his face illuminated by the pale blue light of the screen. He would stare at the balance, his expression slowly turning from panic to utter despair. He'd look up at his wife, his face ashen. "It's not there," he'd say, the words barely audible. The transfer never came. 2-6 there it seems, and the bracement and it stuck it. Sunkouds the best memories on Maidlin Williste Skepton. In the days that followed my meeting with Richard, my silence became my primary weapon. It was not a passive absence of sound. It was an active, strategic presence. While my son and his wife were screaming into a void, my life became more peaceful than it had been in years. I tended to my garden, focusing on the late autumn blooms. I spent afternoons in my woodshop, the scent of fresh-cut cedar filling the air as I worked on a new cabinet. I read the books I'd been meaning to get to for years, losing myself in history and philosophy. I did not check my phone obsessively. I did not wait for an apology. I had made my move on the chessboard, and now I simply let the consequences ripple outwards, knowing they would find their targets with perfect accuracy. The first ripple hit their home life. I could picture Harper, dressed in her $200 yoga pants, waiting for the weekly cleaning service to arrive. She would have grown impatient, tapping her foot on the polished hardwood floors she had never once cleaned herself. Eventually, a text would have arrived from the agency, a message of polite corporate finality. "Dear Miss Vance, we are writing to inform you that your service agreement has been suspended due to non-payment." The dust bunnies would begin their slow, quiet conquest of the penthouse. The next ripple would have found Julian. He would have arrived at his exclusive gym, a place where trainers cost more per hour than most people make in a day. He'd be ready for his session, towel over his shoulder, only to have his key fob denied at the entrance. The receptionist, with a practiced, sympathetic wince, would have informed him that his membership had been frozen. For a man like Julian, whose identity was built on a foundation of effortless access, a closed door is not just an inconvenience, it's an insult to his very being. Then, the smaller daily comforts would have vanished. The curated boxes of organic, pre-portioned meals would stop appearing at their doorstep. They would be forced to navigate a grocery store, a place they probably viewed with the same anthropological curiosity as a museum. The automatic payments for their wine club subscription, their streaming services, their dog walker. One by one, the invisible pillars holding up their effortless life began to crumble. The world they knew was being unplugged, circuit by circuit, and that is when the next phase began, the liquidation. Pride is a luxury item, and theirs was the first thing they had to sell. I can imagine the tense, bitter conversations in their once perfect apartment. Harper, her eyes filled with a rage born of fear, pulling out the designer handbags I had bought her, each one a symbol of a life that was evaporating before her eyes. Julian, his hands trembling slightly, taking off the Swiss watch I had given him for his 30th birthday. They wouldn't go to a common pawn shop. Their pride wouldn't allow it. They would have visited high-end consignment boutiques on Madison Avenue, pretending they were simply curating their collection, all while desperately hoping the check would be large enough to cover next week's expenses. The very gifts I had given them out of love were now being converted into survival cash. The irony was as sharp as it was painful. Their arrogance, once a fortress, was now just rubble. In its place, a raw, primal fear began to grow. The world, for the first time in their lives, was not bending to their will. The safety net they had taken for granted, the one they never even acknowledged, was gone. They were in a free fall, and the ground was rushing up to meet them. Fear is a powerful teacher. It's the one lesson I realized I had failed to give my son, and now the world was teaching it to him for me. Their attempts to reach me became more frantic. My phone, which I kept on silent in my study, became a silent testament to their desperation. Unfamiliar numbers would flash on the screen. I'd let them go to voicemail. An hour later, I would listen. It was always Julian, his voice tight with a forced artificial calm. "Dad, it's me. I'm calling from a friend's phone. Pick up. This isn't funny anymore. We need to talk." The word need was still there. He still believed he was in a position to make demands. More calls came. More texts from numbers I didn't recognize, each one more urgent than the last. They were a frantic storm beating against the stone walls of my silence. But inside those walls, I was at peace. My silence was the only block necessary. It was my answer to every question, my response to every demand, and my rebuttal to every accusation. It was a constant, unwavering, and deeply unsatisfying no. They had asked for space. I was simply giving it to them in a way they had never expected. A month passed. For me, it was a month of quiet routine and newfound peace. For them, it was a month of slow-motion drowning. Richard kept me informed of the key developments, not out of a sense of gossip, but as a matter of legal record. I knew the money they'd gotten from selling their trinkets wouldn't last. It was like using a teacup to bail out a sinking yacht. They were patching small holes, while a gaping chasm was opening up beneath the waterline. And after 30 days of silence, I knew the real storm was about to hit. It arrived in the form of a single piece of paper. It would have been taped to the heavy, imported wood of their penthouse door. An official notice from the building's management company. Its stark black and red lettering a violent contrast to the serene elegance of their hallway. It was a notice to vacate for non-payment of rent. I can imagine the moment Julian found it. The confusion, the immediate assumption that it was a mistake, a clerical error meant for someone else. Then, the dawning horror as he read the details. Tenant name, the Vance Family Trust. Amount overdue, 2 months' rent, totaling $60,000. Harper's reaction would have been disbelief, followed by pure rage. Rent, she would have shrieked, the word foreign and insulting on her tongue. What do you mean, rent? We own this place. Your father bought it for us. And that would have been the moment of true, soul-crushing revelation for my son. He would have had to admit the truth, perhaps for the first time, even to himself. I thought he did, he'd stammer. He always just handled it. They were living in a gilded cage and had never once thought to ask who held the key. The foundation of their entire life, the very floor beneath their feet, wasn't solid ground. It was a rental agreement, and the lease had just expired. The security they had felt was an illusion, and it had just vanished. As if the universe had decided to choreograph their downfall with maximum efficiency. The second blow landed that very same afternoon. Reeling from the eviction notice, their world shrinking to the 4 walls they had less than 30 days to vacate, Harper must have decided she needed to escape. Maybe she was going to a friend's house to complain, or to her mother's to cry. She would have stormed out of the building, her face a mask of fury, and walked towards the spot where she always left her white Range Rover. But the car wasn't there. In its place was a tow truck, its yellow lights flashing with a kind of cheerful indifference. Her car, her status symbol, the vehicle she had so proudly featured in her social media posts, was already hooked. Its front wheels lifted ignominiously off the pavement. A man in a jumpsuit with a clipboard would have met her protest with a shrug. He had the paperwork. The vehicle was being repossessed. Lessee, the Vance Family Trust. Account status, delinquent. This wasn't a private failure. This was a public spectacle. The doorman, who had for years rushed to open her door, would have watched with a carefully neutral expression. Neighbors would have peered from their windows. It was the ultimate social humiliation. A real-time downgrade of her entire existence played out on the streets of Manhattan. She could scream, she could threaten, she could cry. It wouldn't matter. The man with the clipboard held all the power. The truck would have groaned, pulled away from the curb, and taken the last vestige of her curated life with it. That was the breaking point. The 1-2 punch of losing their home and their transportation in the span of a few hours shattered whatever composure they had left. Panic in the face of a declined credit card is one thing. The terror of impending homelessness is another entirely. A person's true character isn't revealed in comfort. It's forged in crisis. I had provided my son a lifetime of comfort. Now the crisis would finally reveal the man I had raised. Their options had dwindled to nothing. They had no allies to call, no hidden funds to access. There was only one car left, Julian's sedan. And there was one last desperate and foolish idea. The source of their problem was also, in their minds, the only possible solution. They had been trying to fight my silence from a distance. Now, they would bring the war to my doorstep. I imagined the final conversation in that empty, echoing apartment was short and grim. All the blame and accusations had likely been exhausted, leaving only the raw, metallic taste of desperation. Julian, his face pale and his eyes burning with a new, dangerous energy, would have grabbed the last set of car keys off the marble countertop. He would have looked at Harper, his partner in a collapsing empire. "Get in the car," he'd say, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance, replaced now with the sharp edge of a man with nothing left to lose. "We're going to Connecticut. He can't ignore us if we're standing on his front lawn. He has to face us." The drive from Manhattan to my home in Connecticut takes about an hour without traffic. For them, I imagine it was an hour filled with a volatile mix of rage, fear, and a desperate, flickering hope that a face-to-face confrontation could change things. They still operated under the delusion that their presence, their emotions, held some power over me. They were coming to my home to make a scene, believing that shame or guilt would be the key to opening the vault. They failed to understand that the man they were coming to see no longer lived there. I was in the rose garden when they arrived. My security system had given me a quiet, discreet notification on my watch a few minutes earlier. Vehicle approaching. I didn't need to check the cameras. I knew who it was. The garden was my sanctuary, the place Eleanor and I had designed together decades ago. Each rosebush had a name, a history. Tending to them was a form of meditation, a slow, deliberate act of creation and maintenance. That day, I had put on my noise-canceling headphones, selecting a playlist of Bach's cello suites. The rich, orderly music filled my head, a perfect soundtrack for the task at hand. The world outside that music, outside the 10-foot stone wall that surrounded my property, simply ceased to exist. I knew they were at the front gate. I could imagine the scene without seeing it. Julian's hand, jabbing at the intercom button with increasing force. Harper, pacing on the gravel driveway, her expensive shoes ill-suited for a battle she was about to lose. They would have been met with the same thing that had tormented them for the past month. Absolute, impenetrable silence. The intercom would not buzz. The gates would not open. From the edge of the garden, through a carefully trimmed hedge, I had a clear view of the road leading to the house. I watched as they abandoned the gate and began to walk the perimeter of the wall, looking for a weakness, a way in. They looked like castaways, searching for a breach in the cliffs of an unbreachable island. Eventually, they reached a section where the ornamental iron fence gave them a view of the backyard, and that's when they saw me. I could feel their eyes on me. It was a tangible thing, a prickling on the back of my neck. I knew they were there, standing just 100 feet away, their faces likely pressed against the cold iron bar. I did not turn. I did not acknowledge them. I focused on the task at hand. I selected a hybrid tea rose, a deep crimson one named Mr. Lincoln. I inspected its leaves for any sign of black spot, my movements slow and methodical. I chose my pruning shears, the steel glinting in the afternoon sun, and made a clean, precise cut just above a 5-leaflet stem. This was the true confrontation. Not a shouting match, but a demonstration. My peace against their chaos. My silence against their noise. My closed garden against their collapsing world. I couldn't hear the words, of course. Through the masterful layers of Bach, their frantic cries were reduced to a faint, irrelevant buzzing, like distant insects. But I could see them. I could see Julian's face, red and contorted with rage. I could see Harper's frantic gestures, her hands pleading one moment and balled into fists the next. They were putting on a grand performance of desperation, but the audience couldn't hear them. They were screaming into a soundproof room. Their power, The emotional leverage they had always held over me was gone. Their words, which had once been able to cut me to the core, could no longer even reach my ears. They must have gone on like that for 10 minutes, their energy eventually giving way to a ragged, hopeless exhaustion. And that's when the security car arrived. My system is programmed to automatically alert the local patrol if the gate intercom is pressed more than 5 times in a minute, or if a vehicle lingers for more than 10. A sleek black sedan with the logo of the security firm on its side pulled up quietly behind their car. A uniformed officer, a man named Samuel, who had patrolled this neighborhood for years, got out. He was the embodiment of professional calm. He didn't rush or escalate the situation. He simply walked over to them, a polite but immovable presence. I couldn't hear the exchange, but I could read the body language. Julian's initial aggressive posture, Harper's tearful, dramatic appeal, and Samuel's patient, unshakable stance. He would have listened, nodded, and then quietly informed them that they were on private property and had been asked to leave. They were no longer the son and daughter-in-law of the owner. They were trespassers. The defeat was absolute. There were no more cards to play. They slumped back to their one remaining car, all the fight gone out of them, and drove away. Samuel's car waited until they were out of sight before pulling away itself. The silence returned, this time deeper and more complete. Only then did I turn. I took off my headphones and the sound of the real world rushed in, the gentle breeze, the chirping of a finch in the oak tree. I walked over to the Mr. Lincoln rose bush. I snipped the perfect deep red bloom I had just pruned and held it, its fragrance rich and complex. I had weathered their final desperate assault without raising my voice, without taking a single step outside my garden. I had won, not by fighting back, but by simply refusing to be part of their storm. 2-6 there it seems, and the bracement and it stuck it. Suncouds the best memories on Maidlin Willistif Gepton. The drive back to the city must have been a long and silent one. Their final desperate gambit had failed in the most humiliating way possible. They had brought all their fury and desperation to my door, and had been turned away not by an angry confrontation, but by a wall of serene indifference. They had been dismissed. Their power was gone. Their resources were gone. And now, their hope was gone. What followed was the inevitable final stage of their collapse, the complete unraveling. It began that evening. It was a storm of communication, directed at a man who was sitting peacefully in his study, reading a book on Roman history. The calls came from numbers I didn't recognize, one after the other. A frantic digital assault. I had set my phone to automatically silence and log any calls not from my contact list. I didn't have to lift a finger. The technology did the work, acting as a silent digital butler, turning away unwanted guests at the door. It wasn't until the next morning, as I drank my coffee and watched the sunrise paint the sky, that I decided to review the events of the night. Not out of concern, but out of a need for documentation. I opened my voicemail and I listened. The first message had come shortly after they would have gotten back to the city. Julian's voice was raw, ragged with fury. You think this is a game? You think you can just hide behind your walls and your security guards? You can't do this to us. This is our life you're destroying. My wife is a wreck. We're losing everything. Do you even care? After everything you were supposed to do for us. The entitlement was still there, buried under the anger. The belief that I owed him this life of luxury. An hour later, another message from a different number. The tone had shifted. The anger was gone, replaced by a syrupy, cloying layer of fake concern. It was a performance, and a bad one at that. Dad, it's me, Julian. We're worried about you. Seriously. Not answering your phone, hiding away in your garden. It's not like you. We're worried about your health. Are you okay? Are you lonely? Please, just let us know you're safe. That's all we want. I shook my head slowly at the transparent manipulation. They weren't worried about my health. They were worried about the health of their bank account. The messages continued throughout the night, a descending spiral into utter desperation. The final one, left sometime around 3 in the morning, was almost unrecognizable. The voice was hoarse, broken. All the anger and pretense had been stripped away, leaving only the sound of a man completely defeated. Dad, please, he whispered, and I could hear the sound of Harper crying softly in the background. Please, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm truly sorry. For the text, for everything. We were stupid. We made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. We'll do anything to make it right.
I'll get a job, a real one, I swear.
We'll pay you back. Just, please don't do this.
Don't throw us away.
We're your family. Please, Dad, just call me back. After listening to the last pathetic plea, I exited the voicemail and opened my phone's blocked call registry. My system keeps a log of all incoming activity. I scrolled through the entries from the previous night, page after page of blocked calls from a handful of unknown numbers, all time-stamped between 7 p.m. and 4 a.m. At the top of the screen, the phone's software had tallied the total. The number was precise: 109. 109 desperate, futile attempts to breach the walls of my resolve. I set the phone down. The experiment was complete. The data was collected. It was time for the final phase. I picked up the phone again and made a single call. "Richard," I said when he answered, "it's time. Send them the email." A few hours later, a message would have appeared in their inbox, an electronic dove in the midst of their flood of despair. It would have come not from me, but from the formal, intimidating address of Bennett and Associates. The subject line would have been simple: meeting regarding the Vance Family Trust. The message itself was brief, professional, and devoid of any emotion. "Dear Mr. Vance and Ms. Vance, on behalf of my client, Arthur Vance, I am writing to invite you to a meeting to discuss the future of the Vance Family Trust. The meeting will be held at our offices this Friday at 10 a.m. sharp. Please confirm your attendance at your earliest convenience." I knew exactly how they would interpret that email. They would not see the cold, legal formality. They would not recognize the language of a summons. They would see it as a white flag of surrender. They would believe that their campaign of desperation, their 109 calls, their pathetic apologies, had finally worked. They would think they had broken me. They would believe they were coming to my lawyer's office to negotiate the terms of their reinstatement. They had no idea they were simply coming to sign their own death warrant. 26 there it seems, and the bracement and it stuck it. Sunkouds the best memories on Maidlin Willistif Gepton. The morning of the meeting, I arrived at Richard's office an hour early. We sat in his private study, the final, notarized documents resting between us on his desk. There was no last-minute hesitation. No flicker of doubt. The preceding month had only solidified my resolve. Richard reviewed the sequence of events one last time, ensuring the execution would be flawless. "Are you ready, Arthur?" he asked. I looked out the window at the city below. "I've been ready for a long time," I said. "Let's go." The conference room was designed to intimidate. A long, narrow space dominated by a colossal slab of polished mahogany. I took my seat at the head of the table, with Richard to my right. The heavy leather-bound document lay directly in front of me. We waited. They arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. Their punctuality was a sign of their desperation. They looked diminished. The weeks of stress had stripped away their glossy veneer. Julian's suit, though expensive, hung off his frame, and his eyes were shadowed with sleepless nights. Harper's makeup couldn't quite hide the anxiety tightening the corners of her mouth. They looked like frightened children, called to the principal's office. They sat down opposite me. The air was thick with unspoken words. Richard broke the silence. "Thank you for coming," he said neutrally. "Arthur has asked for this meeting to discuss the future of the family trust." That was Julian's cue. He cleared his throat and began the performance he had clearly rehearsed. "Dad," he started, his voice straining for sincerity. "First of all, Harper and I just want to say how deeply sorry we are. The last month has been a nightmare, but it's given us time to think. We realize things got out of hand. That text message, it was inexcusable, sent in a moment of frustration. We never meant to hurt you. We love you. You're our father, and that's the most important thing." Harper, on cue, reached across the table as if to touch my hand, her eyes welling up. "We love you so much, Arthur," she whispered. I listened, my gaze steady. His speech was a masterpiece of evasion, filled with we and external pressures, but devoid of true accountability. He wasn't apologizing for what he did. He was apologizing because he had lost his funding. When he finished, silence fell. He looked at me, pleading, waiting for a negotiation. I let the silence stretch until it was unbearable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I placed both hands on the document in front of me and pushed it across the mirror-like surface of the table. It stopped directly in front of Julian. "Thank you for sharing that, Julian," I said, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. "I have listened. Now, I would like you to look at this. This is the amended and restated Vance Family Revocable Trust. It will answer all your questions. With trembling hands, Julian opened the leather cover. They scanned the dense pages, searching frantically for the numbers. Turn to page 12. I guided them. Section 3. Prime Julian. As you can see, I said Clause 3. 1, which previously named you and Harper as the sole beneficiaries, has been legally and irrevocably removed. Furthermore, the monthly allowance and all associated payments have been deleted. There are no longer any financial provisions for either of you. Harper looked up, pale and shaking. So, she stammered, where does the money go? Turn to page 15, I said. Clause 4. 1. The entirety of the trust's assets, an estimated $32 million, will now be transferred to establish a new perpetual endowment, the Vance Next Generation Scholarship. Before they could process the name, Richard added the final weight. The scholarship is a full-ride endowment for low-income students demonstrating exceptional merit in business and industrial design at Connecticut State University. I looked directly at my son. That's the school you dropped out of, Julian, I said levelly. After I paid for 2 full years. I thought it was time someone actually graduated from there with a Vance family investment. That was it. The collapse was total. Harper made a sound like a wounded animal. Julian looked erased. I hadn't just taken their future. I had used his greatest failure to build a monument to someone else's success. It was a perfect, inescapable form of poetic justice. 2/6 there it seems, and the bracement and it stuck it. Sunkouds the best memories on Maidlin Williste Skepton. 6 months later, I stood at a podium in a university auditorium. The air smelled of old books and limitless potential. I wasn't surrounded by the wealthy and entitled, but by students and their families, their faces bright with pride. I looked happier and more at peace than I had in 20 years. This was the inaugural ceremony for the Vance Next Generation Scholarship. I spoke about my life, about starting in a dusty garage with nothing but tools and an idea. I spoke about the dignity of work. A legacy, I told them, is not what you leave for people. It's what you leave inside of them. Looking at those young faces, I knew I had finally made a sound investment. At that same moment, across the state, my son was learning the language of consequence. The penthouse was gone, replaced by a small apartment above a laundromat. The expensive suits were gone. I saw him in my mind's eye on a loading dock, a clipboard in hand, wearing a high-visibility vest. He looked tired, but focused, his shoulders squared with a responsibility he had never known. And Harper, her social media empire a memory, was managing a boutique in a suburban mall, patiently folding sweaters. Their life was difficult. It was a struggle, and for the first time, it was truly theirs. Their relationship was being rebuilt on the solid ground of reality. As I finished my speech and the applause washed over me, I realized the truth. The last and most important gift I ever gave my son wasn't money. It was space. The space to fail, the space to learn. In losing their inheritance, I had given them a chance to earn their own lives. Later that evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set. The air was cool and quiet. My phone, silent for 6 months, buzzed on the table. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. It contained a single word and a question mark. Dad. I stared at the screen. There was no desperation, no demand, just a question, an opening. A small, enigmatic smile touched my lips. The power to answer, the power to decide the future, was now entirely mine. I placed the phone, screen down, on the table. I didn't need to answer right away. I leaned back and listened to the peaceful sounds of the evening. The silence was no longer heavy with absence. It was light and filled with possibility. For the first time in a very long time, the silence felt like a beginning.